everyone. My name is Allison Collins. I'm a commissioner on the Board of Education, and I know folks have had a lot of questions about some of the recent news articles, and especially pertaining to renaming schools. And so I thought we should go to the source because that's always the way to get the best information. And so since I haven't been deeply involved in any of this work, I reached out to the folks who are actually involved. And so we wanted to do just a quick little Zoom call and talk and discussion to answer some of the questions that I've been hearing. So we have Jeremiah Jeffries, who is involved in this project. He is serving as facilitator of some of the groups, and he's also a first grade teacher in our schools. And thank you for your service. And also co-founder of Teachers for Social Justice, and has been doing this kind of work, helping to make curriculum in our schools more welcoming and inclusive and true. We also have President Sanchez with us as well. He was the one who authored the resolution in, I believe it was 2018. He knows more about the history of why we voted on it. And then we also have one of our amazing parent volunteers, Mari Villaluna, who is an amazing parent and an organizer, and was also really crucial in helping. They have been very helpful in removing racist statues in our city. So citywide activist, but also somebody who has been a very strong proponent of making sure that we recognize the Indigenous and Native American community in ways that are respectful. So thank you guys for joining me. I really appreciate you guys taking the time.
Yeah, of course.
So we'll just jump in here. One of the questions people have is, they're thinking, what, why are we doing this now? And then I found out, it was done a while back. And so I was hoping, Mark, you could tell us, what inspired you to write the resolution? When did it get approved? And, a little bit about, who else was involved in inspiring you to put it before the board?
First of all, thank you, Allison, for having us. This is a really important conversation to have and informational or informative for our community. So thank you. And thank you, Mari and Jeremiah as well for being here. So yeah, this is a long-term project. It started before 2018, but the resolution that we passed was authored by myself and Commissioner Stephen Cook, was to basically impanel an advisory group, a task force, which Jeremiah and Mari serve on, as well as others, and Jeremiah will talk about those members in a bit, to look at all of our names, our portfolio of schools and our names, and to essentially suss out which names we need to look at for a name change. And this city, our district, has a rich history of doing just that, looking at our school names and changing them over time. So we've had Hawthorne Elementary, which is now Cesar Chavez, Douglas Elementary, which is now Harvey Milk, Fairmount, which is now Huerta, Sir Francis Drake, which is now Malcolm X. So a school that was predominantly African-American students at the time, and up until '92 when the name change was made, was a school named after a slave ship owner. So community organized and rallied and essentially forced the district to change that name. So this has happened over time for many schools. Raphael Wheel is now Rosa Parks. There's just so many, and it's a wonderful, rich history that we have in San Francisco Unified School District. But we knew that there were still names out there that really needed to be looked at, but those communities, for whatever reason, weren't going to do it on their own. So we wanted to have a systematic approach to renaming, and that's why I and Stephen created this resolution. I think one of the sparks was when, at the time, board member Matt Haney, who's now Supervisor Haney, suggested, I think via Twitter, that we look at Washington High and maybe name it Maya Angelou, an alum of that school. So that was essentially the genesis of the resolution. As is almost always the case, Allison, resolutions from the board tend to take a time to get actually implemented. The timeline for that resolution was that we would have all the names that were needed to be changed through a community process would be brought to the board by last June. So that did not take place. The advisory committee started meeting in December, I believe, has been meeting ever since. There was a little hiatus at the beginning of the COVID crisis. They've been meeting, I think, twice a month since then, and have, deliberated purposefully and with intent to do their work. And I think that the Board of Education has been not involved in that process. We've let the advisory committee take charge as is permitted by the resolution itself, and the advisory committee is going to come back to us with names, I think, in early next year. Now, I just want to say that, of course, there's never the right time to change names, right? There's always going to be arguments. When the proposal for Cesar Chavez happened for Hawthorne, there was much pushback. As was the case when we changed the name Army Street to Cesar Chavez, right? There was huge pushback. When we changed Hawthorne to Harvey Milk, amazing pushback from community members. So there's always going to be those in the community and we wrote this in the resolution as well, that predictably there's going to be folks that have a sentimental attachment to their school names, and that's fine. I have an attachment to the names of the schools I went to as a kid as well. But if any of them were named after a slave owner or somebody who diminished the lives of others, then I would take a look at that name and be okay if there was a recommendation to change it. I think there are a lot of folks out there who, no matter what, will never be with us in a name changing process, and that's fine. But we need to make the argument for why we are doing this, and I think we've made a really good argument. Now, the last thing I'll say before I let others talk is that, yeah, we are in a pandemic. It is really hard. I know that I was a principal. I know what it means when the district, the quote unquote district, tells, mandates, asks, suggests that we do something new and different. It's always one more thing on our plate, and that's many times not okay. Usually the things that we're asking principals to do are compliance oriented and have actually nothing to do with the classroom, nothing to do with the students and families that actually go to the school. We're asking principals and their communities to do something I think they should embrace, which is to actually work together to provide a new name for the school. I think that's an exciting opportunity. Again, however, we are in a pandemic, and I can understand why there's more stress and more anxiety in that process. And I think it's we should be listening to folks, but at the end of the day, we are not going to stop the process. We are going to work with each other to make sure that names are looked at, examined, and ultimately, if needed, to be changed. And the Board of Education makes that final determination.
Thank you for that history. I appreciate that, and also the context. And so, as far as one of the things that people are consistently saying is, like, as far as time, you brought that up about like what people are working on. And when I was first asked by media to talk about it, I realized I didn't know much about it because we haven't even had it on a board agenda since I've been on the board. So that's over a year and a half. And so tell me a little bit about, how much work is staff doing, and who's doing the work, and, maybe Jeremiah or Mari, you can talk about the committee and just how the work is being organized, and is it impacting you as a classroom teacher in your school?
Well, I'll just start off the work that we have 2 staff members that are essentially the liaisons to the committee from the board, who are ensuring that work is ongoing. I couldn't tell you how many hours are put in, but I can tell you this, the amount of time that they're putting in has nothing to do with whether we can open schools back up again.
And then Jeremiah, you're a classroom teacher. You've been working on this committee. Is any of this work affecting stuff that's, can you see, you're going to go to your school, your school might or might not be on the list, but, what impacts do you think it has on, because people are worried about, instruction and us serving students. And I'm just wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
So, hello everyone, I'm Jeremiah Jeffries. I'm a first grade teacher at Reading Elementary School. So going through the school renaming process has been actually really great for my teaching, because it really has made me think about and source sort of who we're lifting up and why. And I've learned so much about the history of San Francisco schools. A lot of the reference materials and research that educators from all over the city have been contributing to the members of the public who've been contributing to the committee. I've been learning so much. Like one of our schools is named after a Board of Education member who stood up for equal rights during the time where they were segregating schools, and Charles Cleveland. And it was really great to learn some of the rich history that we have here in San Francisco. So the committee is an awesome group of people. It's very diverse, and we sort of decided to take a sort of a consensus process, to follow a consensus making process and a modified consensus process to make decisions. We came up with guiding principles to help us identify what schools' names needed to be changed or that we were going to suggest the change for, as well as criteria to help guide schools and a process for schools to engage their school communities to bring up suggestions. And then we're going to look at that and we really held it aligned to the values that we aspire to here in San Francisco and aspire to in the school district.
Thanks. And so, Mari, you've been on the committee. You've been active in trying to make sure that we as a district do a better job in terms of our representation around Native American communities and indigenous communities. And I'm just wondering if you can talk as just a parent leader, what it's been like for you to be in the committee and why is it important to you? Because you're volunteering, right? And that's kind of tricky when you have a little kid, right, on top of stuff. So, why is that an important kind of commitment that you've made when I'm sure you have a lot of other stuff to do?
Yeah, so like you said, not just only my parent, I'm a solo parent, 100% solo with a very active 4-year-old. And I remember our first time we met, like in person, because we started meeting earlier this year before COVID or whatever. And I remember my toddler just kind of all over the place in the board chambers because there was no childcare.
You're the one that got the childcare happening. I want to say thank you for that as well. When we come back to the board, we'll have childcare because of you. But anyway, continue, please.
And thank you to the board for listening and the superintendent for listening about that request. But yeah, so I think one of the reasons why this work is so important, especially as a parent of a 4-year-old and a future SFUSD student, is that I want my kid to enter into a school that represents our SFUSD core values. So, student-driven, social justice, right? Diversity, unity, fearless. Like, I really believe in those core values and I really hold them very close to me just as a parent. And so, like, if my kid is going to a school that's named after someone who committed genocide or a massacre or was a slave owner, against, Black and or indigenous peoples or even another group, then that's not something that reflects their values. And so that's important for me to constantly be there, at the school board meetings, reminding, our school board and our school district what our core values are, what we say, what we are, what our mission says we are. And being a volunteer on this committee with all the other volunteers, like Jeremiah said, I've learned a lot. There are some things that I didn't even know. I was like, what? Because when you get the research from different educators and you do some research yourself too, there's over 200 names that you have to go through. It's a lot. And one of the most amazing things I learned actually about how one of the first, I guess, historical civil rights cases in the state of California happened right here in San Francisco. And I would have never known that without being on this committee.
That's Spring Valley?
Yeah.
Which school is that?
Oh, well, it's not the school. So Sutro Elementary, it's the opposite. But Sutro, there was African-American man, I'm sorry, I forgot his name. Maybe Jeremiah can remember, but he was denied entry into the Sutro Baths. And then he actually sued Sutro, and he won. He actually won his case. And it was months after there was a civil rights law that happened in California. So whoever this man was, he was really, very involved with reading the newspaper, watching the news or whatever, because it was a very recent law. And so he filed and he won.
There's also the case, the landmark case around separate but equal that was really impacted here in San Francisco as well, where a Japanese student was denied entry, actually to my school where I teach now, Reading Elementary School, which at the time was all white, and but now is one of the most diverse schools and home to the first Arabic language program in the city. But it's one of the most diverse schools in San Francisco now. So we're very proud of that history and change over time for our school.
So what are some of the names that, you're asking? I mean, on a certain level, I understand, people are kind of finding out new information, and changes kind of can be a little scary or unnerving, but also I think it can be exciting too. And I started thinking about like Amy Tan. She was a graduate of, she went to Galileo where I used to teach as an English teacher. I always said that. People have mentioned Maya Angelou. It's kind of got me thinking, what are some names, that are missing? And I'm just wondering if you guys had any, have heard any suggestions from folks, or, what your thoughts are about, like Mark, you said, this is a fun opportunity for us to both learn our history, but also think about, what do we want a school to be named, or what do we want, to hold up? And so I just wondered if any of you guys had any thoughts on that.
Well, I would just say also not just the name of a person, but concepts are important to look at as well. June Jordan School of Equity, right? We could name schools after more than one person who have to share the same values. Like it's really limitless almost. But we do want to reflect our own values as a city, and that's important. I just briefly, when I was principal at Cleveland, which was referenced by Jeremiah, that school board member from the early 1900s, I had always wanted to help the community come to the conclusion to rename it Dolores Huerta, but I was never able to do that. I wanted the community to really run with that, and I didn't want to run the process. And so ultimately it did happen at Fairmount. I think fewer than 10% of our schools are named after women. So that's super important to me, is to have a portfolio of names that we can look at that will reflect, equally the fact that women, we can name a school after Michelle Obama, not Barack, there's so many opportunities out there to look at. So I'm interested to hear what Jeremiah and Mari think about the potential names.
Well, one of the cool things about our committee is we do have representation from the Ramaytush Ohlone nation and people, even though they're unrecognized federally. But this was their land, and so it was really important for us to have that representation on the committee. And so we took steps to do that. And I think in naming and the alternatives that are being considered, some names that schools have suggested already, one was like James Baldwin, right, who was a force to be reckoned with, intellectual, who really set a tone for what it means to give critical thought and participation in our society, as like to be really civically engaged. And I think that's one of the really important values, like holding up values. We even talked about sort of even moving away from names, because they can be so perilous, as it were. But really focus on values or region or natural features of the environment that schools are in, and sort of pursuing that. It's taking down symbols like of white supremacy is really important. And we're just, and it's so funny, we're just getting to that place in our society where people are calling for and willing to do it, right? It's not like these calls for change are not new. Students have been making calls for change, parents, community members, then those voices have been marginalized or ignored until now, where we're at a place where people actually, it shows in some ways how we've grown as a society in some ways, even though it feels in this Trumpian era that we've retreated back to a worser time. I think the field of ideas is stronger, and we're winning in some places. And so this is an expression of that. And so, but racism and white supremacy hasn't taken a break. And so we're not going to slow our work down in dismantling it. We're going to pursue that with all the vigor that we can, without sacrificing the current work, which is also about uprooting racism and shifting the system so that there's actually equity and accountability and strong outcomes for everyone.
Thanks. And then Mari, I'll let you have the last word. What gets you excited when you think about school renaming? As a parent that's going to have a child that could, my kids are leaving the system, your child's going to be entering the system. What kinds of schools would you want to be enrolling your child in?
What gets me really excited is that my child could go to a school named after you know, someone really amazing and like someone that people might not really know a lot about. So like one of the name suggestions that we got from one of the schools was actually by a child of their parent was the first African-American principal at that school, right? And they were like, hey, like, this is pretty important SFUSD history. So not only just like, you know, national history, global history, but also like thinking of our own school districts and like the stuff and the ways that we move forward in our progress. I would like to say one thing too, with just ending is, I think people need to realize that this school naming is being birthed out of movements that us as collectively as human beings in this nation have participated in. So when Mark was writing the legislation over 2 years ago, at that time, there was another racial reckoning happening in the nation. Charlottesville just happened, and Heather Heyer, rest in peace, was murdered, right? And so there was this big call at that time to deal with white supremacy and take it head on. And so people in the South were taking down statues, and people in the South were changing their school names, and their movements influenced here out in San Francisco. And just again in June, right? George Floyd was lynched, and along with many other of our African-American siblings, right, have gone through, you know what I'm saying, not just police brutality, but police murders, right? And so billions of people around the world left their houses during a global pandemic and said, it's time to deal with this now. And so that shows to me that it doesn't matter if we're in a global pandemic. We can do both. And also, to keep it real, the work that's being done right now is being all volunteer. It's being done by the parents in the school district. It's being done by the educators like Jeremiah. It's being done by the grandmas like Mary Travis Allen. You know, it's being done by our community members, right? It's being done by our SFUSD students. We have student representation on the committee. That was very important for us to have an under 18 SFUSD student voice, not just one, we have two, right? And so I think people need to really remember what happened in June, right? When everybody was saying Black Lives Matter, and you know, we're like, let's deal with this now.
Still saying it, Mari. We're still saying it. Well,
Some people aren't saying it as much.
I think
keep going.
I think it's really important, Mari, what you're saying. But the undercurrent, there's an undercurrent out there that's being amplified by some in the media, and unfortunately our mayor and other elected officials, that for some reason because we're in a pandemic and because we can't open schools right now, we shouldn't be looking at anything else. And so that we need to pause or put on hold our racial equity work. I don't buy that argument, and I think it's a minority argument, but it's an amplified one that we need to. And I think this is a really good reason why Allison is doing this, is to put an alternative voice out there.
Thanks. And so I'll chime in just at the end here. One thing that's been really resonating for me is this quote by Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And he, as you know, like at the end of his life, he was actually doing a lot. He was talking about a lot. He wasn't just focused on racial justice. He was also focused on the Vietnam War. And he was also focused on justice for workers and workers' rights. And that was actually pretty dangerous, right? Because when you get everybody together, not just, Black folks, but also working class folks that are white and Latinx and other races, that, and then challenge, the war machine. But what he said during that time, he said, it may well be that we will have to repent in this generation, not merely for the vitriolic words and the violent actions of the bad people, but for the appalling silence and indifference of the good people who sit around and say, wait on time. Somewhere we must come to see that human progress never rolls in on the wheels of inevitability. It comes through the tireless efforts and the persistent work of dedicated individuals who are willing to be co-workers with God. And without this hard work, time itself becomes an ally of the primitive forces of social stagnation. So we must help time and realize that the time is always ripe to do what's right. And I believe that is what we are doing. This has been a long time coming. And I think we can walk and chew gum at the same time. And I really am grateful for your leadership, President Sanchez, and also for your leadership, Mari and Jeremiah, as community members. And for those who are on the committee and those who've contributed that are not in this space, but I know there's tireless efforts, as Mari said, of folks who've been working on this and have been contributing to this effort. And so I just want to say thanks for taking the time to answer questions. I want to continue to be a space. I think this is a learning moment, and I think I'm learning all the time about some of these names. I'm like, I want to know what's going on with that. You know, it's an opportunity for us as educators too, and as parents, to have conversations with students. Is there any final words you guys want to add before we close out the conversation? Mm-hmm.
I want to just say our process has been open to the public from the very beginning. All our meetings follow the Brown Act and Sunshine Ordinance.
Okay.
They're all agendized, and we have our own website under SFUSD committees. We have our own page, and we have our own email, and people have been submitting names to us, and names in schools that should be changed or not changed or whatever. Okay. We have an email, and we get those emails about, I think, once every week or 2 weeks. We get like a big stack of all the public comment. So I just want everybody to know that this is a very openly democratic process.
Okay, great. So they can find it on the web. I can help promote. Yep. You can help promote. We'll all promote so people can make it easy to find that information. Yes. Thank you for saying that. All right.
Thank you, Commissioner Collins. Your work has been exemplary on the board. Your production and thoughtfulness and all that you do is very inspiring to us as educators and to the public.
Thank you for taking the time. I know everybody's busy, and Mark, you have to get ready for a class tomorrow, right?
Yeah.
Teaching distance.
Jeremiah.
And with Jeremiah. So thanks for taking the time, and really appreciate your transparency and openness in just sharing the process and your thoughts. So have a good night. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thank you again, Allison.
Bye.
Bye, y'all. Peace.
Wait, stop recording.